The truth behind the Nephilim giants, how tall were they really? Just how colossal were the Nephilim giants, those mysterious warrior kings who roamed the earth before and after the flood? Imagine being so towering that even the tallest structures of our world would pale in comparison. But how tall were they really? We have at least 5 major ancient sources from the BC period, each claiming different heights for these giants. Which of these heights is accurate? And more importantly, what does this say about the truth behind the legends of the Nephilim? Many skeptics dismiss the existence of these giants, not just because of their enigmatic origins, but because reconciling their existence with modern science and archaeological findings seems impossible. But what if ancient texts offer us a clue, suggesting a more plausible height for these giants? And what if the biblical account of Goliath's height doesn't mean what we've always thought? Prepare yourself, because we're about to embark on a deep investigation into one of the most perplexing mysteries of the ancient world. This study wasn't easy. It took me hours, weeks even, poring over manuscripts and dissecting a dense 35-page academic paper. But don't worry, I've done the hard work so you don't have to. If you're curious though, I'll leave a link in the description for the brave souls who want to dive into the full research. Let's start with source number 1 first, Enoch, arguably the most detailed and controversial text we have on the Nephilim giants. In the Book of Enoch, and indeed in the Old Testament, the Nephilim are portrayed as the offspring of fallen angels and human women, a hybrid race with supernatural origins. With such a mysterious background, it's no surprise that their height would be just as extraordinary. But here's where things get complicated. Michael Heiser, a noted scholar and author of a companion book to the Book of Enoch, highlights that we have multiple translations of 1st Enoch, and they don't all agree on the giant's height. In chapter 7, verse 2, the Greek fragments claim that the giants were 3,000 cubits tall. If we assume a standard Hebrew cubit of about 18 inches, that would make these giants a staggering 4,500 feet tall, over twice the height of the world's tallest building in Dubai. But wait, the Ethiopic version gives a different measurement, stating the Nephilim were great giants whose height was 300 cubits. That's still an incredible 450 feet tall. So, which version is correct? Here's the problem: many of our ancient copies of Enoch are damaged or partially illegible, making it hard to decipher the exact text. Some scholars believe that one of these numbers is likely a scribal error. But even if we assume the 300 cubits is accurate, it still presents a challenge. How could beings that were 9 times taller than the tallest dinosaurs have existed without leaving any trace? Where are their skeletons? This discrepancy leads many to dismiss the Nephilim as pure mythology, a story too far-fetched to be real. And perhaps they might toss aside parts of the Bible along with it. But what if there's another explanation? What if the ancient writers weren't describing the giants' literal height, but rather exaggerating their size to emphasize how terrifying they were? Exaggeration was a common literary device in ancient times. Did the people of that era understand these heights as symbolic rather than literal? Possibly. But the second explanation is even more intriguing. Here's where things get really interesting. If you look up 1st Enoch 7:2 online, you might find that it doesn't mention the giant's height at all. So why was this crucial detail removed? According to some scholars, the original Book of Enoch might never have specified the giant's height in the first place. It's believed that early translators misread a damaged manuscript and mistakenly added a reference to their height. Instead of describing their size, the original text may have been talking about 3 races of giants born from the union of angels and humans, one of which was called the Iliad. Over time, this was misinterpreted as a measurement, a mistake that went uncorrected until as recently as 2004. If this theory is true, then we might have been chasing a ghost all along. The Book of Enoch might not give us a definitive answer on the giant's height, which means we need to keep digging. The quest to uncover the true stature of the Nephilim isn't over yet. So where do we turn next? Stay tuned as we continue this investigation, unraveling the ancient mysteries and separating fact from fiction in our search for the truth behind these legendary giants. The answers might be closer and more shocking than you think. Source number 2. This one is again trickier than it seems at first. It's the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel. In my previous videos, we discovered that the Nephilim turned up again in the Bible after the flood. You're probably familiar with one of their descendants, Goliath, the most famous giant in the entire Bible. Well, most people don't realize that his lineage is actually mentioned in the Bible. 1 Samuel 17 says he's from Gath. Well, Joshua 11-22 tells us who lived in Gath. The Anakim, whom we find out in Numbers 13-33, were descendants of the Nephilim. So, if you put it all together, Goliath was from Gath. The Anakim lived at Gath. The Nephilim were Anakim. Goliath, probably a Nephilim. If we can discover his height, we can approximate the height of the Nephilim. 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 4 tells us exactly how tall Goliath was. It seems, if you pull out your modern Bible, it likely says Goliath was 6.5 cubits tall, just under 10 feet tall. For reference, the tallest human to ever live that we know of was 8 foot 11 inches according to the Guinness Book of World Records. Okay, so we're closer to the ballpark of scientific discoveries, but we're still kinda dabbling in sci-fi land here. Could this be a case of exaggeration to make Goliath seem more menacing? Maybe? Or here's a plot twist. Not every Bible lists the same height for Goliath. There's another option. The height of 6 cubits in a span comes from a translation of the Hebrew Bible called the Masoretic text. It's often called the traditional Hebrew Bible because that's the text that most of our modern Bible translations are based off of. However, it's from the medieval period, and it's not our oldest biblical manuscript. In fact, our oldest biblical sources say something else entirely. That's rather suspicious to me. So I went back further to source number 3. The Dead Sea Scrolls and a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. The Greek Septuagint is abbreviated LXX, and it's super interesting because that's the translation that the writers of the New Testament read and quoted from in their day. So for me, I tend to value it highly in my research. What did these sources say about Goliath? Well, in that exact same verse, 1 Samuel 17:4, it says, Goliath was 4 cubits and a span, 2 full cubits shorter. That would make Goliath just under 7 feet tall. So he could play in the NBA if he were here today. So what happened to the modern Bible? That's not really that tall. At first, it seems the story of the giant Goliath may have been exaggerated a little. Some scholars suggest that the Jews tended to exaggerate the height of the giants as time went on. There's even a manuscript that says Goliath's height was 5 cubits in a span. There's a good chance, though, that this scribe wasn't sure which number was correct. 4 cubits? 6 cubits? So he may have just split the difference. But what should we do? First, we can probably wipe the 5-cubit option off the table, because the vast majority of manuscripts say 4 cubits or 6 cubits. It's decision time. Usually I am tempted to go with the oldest writing. After all, in many cases that is the safer bet. That would put Goliath just under 7 feet tall, which could be corroborated by archaeologists, and still make Goliath a giant in his day. After all, the average Israelite at that time was only around 5 feet tall. Josephus, a Jewish historian, also listed Goliath at 4 cubits and a span, making the source used by most Bibles look more like an exaggeration. However, once again, it's more complicated than it seems. I thought I had this mystery solved until I solved this. In a research paper by Dr. Clyde E. Billington called Goliath and the Exodus giants. How tall were they? He suggested that maybe this isn't a case of scribal exaggeration after all. Clyde uncovered an important clue, but it throws a monkey wrench in our investigation. The problem is, many different nations had a measurement called a cubit, and apparently nobody agreed on exactly how long it was. There was no universal standard. Even worse, a cubit was an approximate measurement, not a fixed standard of measurement. As Clyde's paper says, the ancient cubit was the distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. The span was the distance between the tip of the little finger to the tip of the thumb when the fingers were spread as far apart as possible. The ancients assumed that two spans made one cubit. I wonder if you can detect the problem here. This kind of measurement is not very scientific. The length of a cubit varied depending on who was doing the measuring. Kind of like how originally 1 foot wasn't a fixed 12 inches, but eventually it was standardized based on the length of King Henry VIII's 12-inch long foot. So two people could measure Goliath and come up with completely different numbers. A tall person would have a longer forearm than a short person, meaning we can't know Goliath's exact height based on the Hebrew cubit. We can only guess. Clyde argues that when scholars estimated a cubit to be a fixed 18 inches, they made a mistake, and he recommends that modern Bibles remove the footnote that says a cubit is equal to 18 inches. Since David killed Goliath, he's probably most likely the person who measured him before cutting his head off. David was an average height for an Israelite. Clyde's paper says, for those who are 5, their cubit would be about 16 inches. Assuming a 16.5-inch cubit for a David, who is 5A, would indicate that Goliath was about 8 tall. Note, this matches the height of the world's tallest person, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. Okay, now we're starting to get into the world of realism. Incidentally, David may have measured Goliath with his helmet on, and this may have increased his height. The Philistines are known for their plumed helmets, which they wore. So, if you take the helmet off, he might actually be a little bit shorter than that. Well, now we're stumped again. What are we supposed to think? Accounting for the fact that a true length of common cubit varies. Goliath could now be anything between 7 feet tall and 10 feet tall. We need a tiebreaker. So what other sources do we have left? There is one more ancient source from another nation that mentions giants, and they had a standardized cubit, which could really help us narrow down the range here. Source number 4. Ancient Egyptian writings speak of Canaanites whom they called Shasu. This was a general term that included Israelites, the Nephilim's descendants called the Anakim, and quite a few other people groups. The Egyptian text called The Craft of the Scribe says this: the face of the past is dangerous with Shasu, hidden under bushes. Some of them are 4 or 5 cubits, nose to foot, with wild faces. The difficulties continue though, as the English translation of this line is actually kind of deceiving. Egyptologist Charles Ayling says, this phrase nose to foot in hieroglyphics actually refers to total height. Talk about confusing. Now here's where we can find some valuable numbers though. The Egyptians were one of the few civilizations who did have a standardized length for their cubit. It wasn't a loose estimate like the ordinary Hebrew cubit. According to Billington, the actual size of the Egyptian cubit was 20.65 inches. This would mean the Egyptians saw giants in Canaan ranging from 6x to 8, right around the height of the tallest human known to walk the earth. What about that discrepancy in the Bible though? Is the modern Bible's height for Goliath an exaggeration? Billington has an interesting theory. According to Jewish tradition, the Greek Septuagint was translated by request for one of Egypt's pharaohs, Ptolemy II. Billington's paper says the Ptolemies, descendants of a general of Alexander the Great, were Greeks, and they were Greek-speaking, as were almost all of the citizens of Egypt's capital city of Alexandria. Jews made up about 1/4 of the population of Alexandria, and in time they forgot their Hebrew. So, the Jews in that area of the world were speaking Greek at this time, and so was Egypt's pharaoh. Who knew? What would this mean for our investigation? If the translators wanted the Greek Old Testament to make sense to Pharaoh and the other Greek-speaking Egyptians and the Jews living there, well, they would have to convert Goliath's height from the common Hebrew cubit to the Egyptian royal cubit, which is standardized. This does make sense. If Clyde is correct, then no exaggeration took place from the original biblical text to the modern Bible. They're just using a different cubit in both cases. The discrepancy between the modern Bible, the Septuagint, and the Dead Sea Scrolls could possibly be explained this way. Simple unit conversion. 4 cubits in a span in Egyptian royal cubits is approximately equal to 6 cubits in a span in ordinary Hebrew cubits. All of the biblical sources might actually be in agreement. They're just using different cubits. What if Clyde is wrong, though? It seems we would still be dealing with a non-standardized cubit, so it may be a mistake to assume that the cubit equals 18 inches. We can't use the ordinary Hebrew cubit to calculate Goliath's exact height. We can only estimate a range. There is another subtle piece of evidence in the Bible, though, but from a different author. Source number 5. Deuteronomy chapter 3. Here's another giant, King Og, whom the Israelites fought. The only things we know about this guy is he was a giant, and he had a very large iron bed that was displayed like a trophy after he was killed. It says his bed was 9 cubits long, an approximate 13.5 feet. The true length of Og's bed, though, it's probably unknown to us. But it's still safe to say he was probably unusually tall to have a bed that big, corroborating that Goliath had an unusual height. I should note that there is one more source that I left out of my analysis. The Quran also speaks of ancient giants that some think may be the Nephilim. This book says their height was around 100 feet tall, but I chose not to include this because it's an outlier and it was written quite a bit later than the other sources, around 650 AD. Over 1,000 years or more later than the biblical sources and the Egyptian text. Clyde Billington's paper is going to go on to argue that Goliath could have been on the taller end of this range we've discovered, taller than the world's tallest person. And he bases this on what we know about the armor worn by Goliath and the Philistines. Goliath's armor would have been very heavy, and Clyde argues that Goliath would have had to be extremely tall in order to be able to move in it. No warrior would ever wear armor they couldn't move in. Me? I see his point. But I'm not totally convinced. Consider this view from the book Origin of Evil Spirits by R.G.T. Wright, and it involves the origin of demons. In the New Testament, Mark chapter 5 mentions a man possessed by a demon who was so strong that he couldn't be restrained even with chains. This man was of normal size, but he's directly linked to the Nephilim. But how? It doesn't say anything about Nephilim. Aha! Well, the original Jewish definition of a demon was a disembodied spirit of a Nephilim. Yeah, they thought that when the giants died, because their spirit was half angel and half human, it couldn't get into heaven or hell, yet roamed the earth looking for a new body. So according to this view, when Goliath died, for example, his spirit may have gone on to possess someone, giving them supernatural strength. See the link in the description to read more of Archetype Wright's work. It's really good. This is just a guess, but I once heard a story from a prison guard who was attacked by an inmate who was on drugs. He tried to defend himself by beating the inmate with a nightstick, but the prisoner couldn't feel a thing. He seemed to be invincible and unnaturally strong. All this to say is I'm not sure Goliath had to be 10 feet tall to carry that armor. There may be other solutions. Maybe something about being possessed gave them supernatural strength or blocked pain receptors in the brain similar to how drugs do. I don't know, but somewhere between 6 feet and 9 feet tall is probably our answer. I'm curious to know what you think of this evidence. Do you think all of these sources can truly be reconciled to be saying the same thing? Are you compelled by Clyde's theory that the difference is a simple conversion problem? Or a problem of a cubit not having been standardized? And did I successfully change your mind to think that the giants might be able to be reconciled with modern science and archaeology? Let me know in the comments. But now, have you ever wondered how the Nephilim turned up again after the flood? Watch this video next to hear 3 theories.